more so than other artistic mediums due to it being in its infancy and fundamentally appealing to and being made for children, and also fetishizing violence as a consequence of its inception in post-modernity. Villainous or otherwise ontologically evil individuals are a trapping of the space of video games. Even in texts such as Nier, where an edge of sympathy is lent to its villains, or even puzzle games such as Panel de Pon, where there is no explicit violence, there is a conflict and a conquering, a total defeat of one entity by another, an exertion of the player self's will. The Legend of Zelda is no different in this respect. Its swords and sorcery action-adventure roots similarly elevate the fantastic ceaseless violence of the postmodern world, every conflict requiring a villain to be destroyed in totality. Due to the amount of volumes in the series, the way The Legend of Zelda depicts its opposition is both varied and unchanging, a morality play that is ever in favor of imperial hegemony. Each The Legend of Zelda text discusses different explications and intricacies to the core fascistic ideas of the series, even if they are all strewn about recreating the trappings of the same violent and destructive monomyth. The original The Legend of Zelda is a listless wasteland, one where, while there is theoretical opposition to Link as posed by the text's opening crawl, ultimately most enemies ignore Link. The major exception to this, however, is the Prince of Darkness, Ganon. Ganon is presented as an absolute evil compared to Satan himself in the game's opening crawl, and is one of the few obstructive entities in Hyrule that actively commits violence against Link in their chance encounter. Ganon is the primordial representation of evil in the Legend of Zelda canon, is the blueprint that all future texts are in response to with their particular discourses on the nature of evil, and much like the rest of the romantic escapist fixtures of The Legend of Zelda, Ganon himself is simple. He's animalistic, not given any humanity beyond comparison to Lucifer, implying that he was once something the text views as more spiritually pure than he was. He is an interloper that has toppled the decayed and lethargic status quo of Hyrule, and for that transgression, The Legend of Zelda posits, he must be slaughtered and his revolution must be undone. He is not even allowed material reasoning for doing what he does. After all, there can be no question that the player self must be in the right to uphold these systems, that their claim over this land is so wholly divinely ordained, Link and the player both even acquiring a Bible along the journey, that Ganon must be a creature of pure evil for standing in the way of that. The Legend of Zelda, as previously established, is a wasteland to be defined by the player expression alone, but what happens when the text then creates an Ouroboros where the player self must conquer the player self? Zelda II: The Adventure of Link, as a response to The Legend of Zelda, is abstract in its construction. Throughout, the player is confronted most often with a more intimate perspective of Link than the detached bird's eye view of the first game, and so the bond of player self is further melded. Zelda II also further hollows out its world. Link's quest through Hyrule is now vague and obscure, trying to save an inexplicable second Princess Zelda as compared to the Princess Zelda of the first game, from a perpetual slumber set into motion years before he was ever born, and a conflict that holds no survivors due to the passage of time, comatose princess notwithstanding. This is all punctuated by the people Link meets throughout the spaces of the work, all helpful yet ethereal, dispensers solely of hints and lacking in character beyond that. In spite of a more populated setting, Link cannot meaningfully communicate with these people, still a lonely existence for the player self. This is all compounded by the true apex of this text's further isolation. Zelda II features no conventional antagonist. Link's quest not punctuated as a great crusade against true evil, but as a series of trials placed by his forefathers. There are followers of Ganon as a recurrent threat, attempting to resurrect him through the death of the player self, a reversal of the perverse conquest of The Legend of Zelda, but they are apocryphal in their existence, listless stragglers that attack mindlessly, existing only as a violent death rattle of the first game. In a work without a villain for the player self to conquer, then there is only one entity for them left to commit violence against: themselves. Zelda II ends its trials with a duel between Link and Dark Link, a reflected mirror, a shade of the player's own existence. Zelda II postulates that to conquer a text, to fully lay claim to it in its entirety, is both a destruction of the text, its constituents left scattered and vengeful yet aimless, and a destruction of the self, a mirror easily shattered and a conflict the player self had no involvement in, blissfully resolved as much as it can be at least. Zelda II says that, in conquering, the deception of the art cannot be perceived, and yet the deceivers are vilified in turn, and thus the world of The Legend of Zelda is ever contradictory, where the smoke and mirrors of monarchical hegemonic fantasy is upheld, and something that should not go conquered by player or beast, but the illusions of any who seek to upset that status quo must be destroyed. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past begins several traditional parts of the series' identity, both an ever-changing material context which recurring symbols and ideas are applied to, and that Ganon is one of these symbols applied in many different forms and alter egos, in this instance the character Aghanim. Aghanim is a sorcerer who takes over Hyrule extremely quickly after first arriving from a foreign land and killing the king and imprisoning revisiting this work's Princess Zelda. As A Link to the Past is the first Legend of Zelda game to have a higher focus on narrative sequence, it is no longer simply player-defined what Aghanim is. Though his motivations for obtaining the Triforce for Ganon are never explicated, it does not matter. Aghanim is both an expression of evil in his role as a master of illusions to deceive the player self and the royal family, and that these betrayals upset the reactionary balance of Hyrule at all. Link knows little of Aghanim other than that he stands in the way to the monarchical systems of abuse continuing as they always have. Aghanim is positioned as a player self in response to the player's own Link, another life that exists to act out another's will, but the irony of this dichotomy is lost on the text. Aghanim must be slain so Link can reintroduce the status quo, with an ending that implies an eternity of the systems that exist going unchallenged. It does not matter if the player and Ganon are similar in every functional way. Ganon, and by extension Aghanim, are foreign manipulators that seek to dismantle the systems of power in place. Regardless of if that's for good or for ill, it is simply never stated. All that matters to A Link to the Past as a work is that this moment in history be preserved until the planets fall to dust. Entropy, however, is eventually acknowledged in the Legend of Zelda series with the work Link's Awakening, a depiction of an ephemeral moment in hypnagogia experienced by both player self and the enigmatic dreamer known only as the Windfish. Link's Awakening, even in its ludic similarity to the titles that predate it, is yet another rejection of the Legend of Zelda as form in the same tradition as Zelda II. Link's Awakening in direct parallel to the fascistic end of history that A Link to the Past purports to present, both through it being a direct sequel and through Link dismantling a romantic portrait in decay, a rejection of the preservation of status quos. This is not, however, a virtuous shift. Koholint Island, as compared to the destructive regime of Hyrule, is a peaceful island community, pastiche of post-modernity frozen in time it may be, constructed out of Nintendo's other literature. Link's Awakening is the first text in The Legend of Zelda to openly and explicitly reject the player self's conquering of it. The nightmares which make Link's formless opposition throughout the text only occupying that role as a means to prevent the text from coming to fruition, a desperate outcry against will exerted over the sub-reality. When the dream ends, the game shuts off, the entities within cease to exist. Should the player hollow out and conquer Link's Awakening, then there will be no Koholint Island. In the final throes of the nightmare's opposition to the player self, it invokes Ganon's own player self Aghanim in a death rattle that echoes through both space and time. It attempts to position itself as a player self in its last bid to cling to life, but ultimately can never ascend to the real, and so once more, no matter how grotesquely, the player stomps out yet another obstacle in yet another game, and the nightmare ends before time can wear down its cartridge. Link's Awakening is the acknowledgement that the dream must end, the end of history cannot exist, and that the game must shut off, but only because it stands as an affront to the Hylian hegemony. Koholint Island prevents Link from upholding the systems of abuse, and so it must be destroyed, so says The Legend of Zelda. This ideology truly comes to a head in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, with the advent of Ganondorf as the main antagonistic force of the text. Unlike the last three outings at Hyrule, where the narratives open on it already in decay, Ocarina of Time opens on the world as the work feels it should be, and actively displays Ganondorf's influence on it as a perversion of its fascistic nostalgia. Ocarina of Time, even more so than the previous works in The Legend of Zelda, is so much a coming-of-age narrative. Ganondorf's presence posits a rude awakening to the nature of adult life beyond idyllic childhood. Nostalgia is of an inherently reactionary character, and to some extent Ocarina of Time understands this. It is only when the childhood romanticism discarded and the postmodern wasteland confronted that the player self achieves full power and satisfaction, the ultimate space for play. However, Ocarina of Time is ultimately still in the Legend of Zelda game, and ultimately still in the tradition of its reactionary fantasy forefathers. This is the first time in the series that Ganondorf is not only othered as a foreign beast-like entity as he was in the previous entries he and his equivalencies have appeared in, but now he is given a specific racialized identity, beginning a long history of The Legend of Zelda's Orientalist racism toward Arabs. The Gerudo are a people that have been discussed at length already in other writing on this channel, and so much of Ganondorf both going forward in The Legend of Zelda and in Ocarina of Time specifically is tied to this racialization. The way the Gerudo are discussed and vilified as an exotic other to be feared and isolated from the rest of Hyrule with no self-determination allowed to them is a grotesque one and exposes the inherently fascistic character of The Legend of Zelda more so than anything else which came before it. While all four of the initial texts were about a reactionary restoration of an imagined glorious past as achieved through intense voyeuristic violence on the part of the player, Ocarina of Time is the first to point to a specific racial identity and mark them as the reason for why this illusory past cannot be restored. The only Gerudo positioned as good one who actively goes against the interests of her people to uphold the white hegemony. Like all fascist propaganda, once Ganondorf is defeated, the player self-triumphant, the world is restored to its ideal existence as presented by the text. Even more strongly reactionary than A Link to the Past because of how Ocarina of Time uses time travel to restore that imagined past that lionizes in a literal sense. That world where Link did not have to acknowledge anything beyond the Empire's idea of perfection maintained, and yet not to go unquestioned for long. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask is extremely interesting in so many ways, though chief among the concerns of this text being the capricious and enigmatic main villain, Majora. Gone are the assertions of Hylian dominance, be they taking place within its borders or on islands fabricated in dreams. Link is here to find a friend lost at the end of Ocarina of Time and to save an apocryphal alternative continuity. Though he does these things through violence, that violence is no longer upheld by the monarchical hegemony of Hyrule. The governing body of liberal democracy in the land of Termina 2 caught up in its own inefficacy to have opinions about it or take notice of Link's quest. Majora's Mask, in a similar sense to Link's Awakening, is the conquest of the nostalgic dream of childhood, a romantic ideal frozen in time. But unlike that work's murder of a world that simply wished to be born for the sake of Hylian and player self-dominion, Majora's Mask is a murder of the decayed truth that Ocarina of Time refuses to acknowledge. It is impossible to ever enter the imagined amazing past that fascism purports existed, both because it never existed and because it is impossible to enter the past again, always something only extant to inform and cause the now. Majora, the entity himself, is an imp-like figure obsessed with play, taking on Link's friend Skull Kid from Ocarina of Time as his own player self and vessel to cause whatever cruelty he chooses to exert upon the world. Everything in Majora's Mask, all the ill conditions of the sub-reality, can be traced back to what is essentially a hedonistic and immature gamer exerting ceaseless and pointless suffering upon the text for his own pleasure. It is a pornographic means of engaging with the work, it only extant as entertainment, and it is that Link must ultimately confront after 5 games of doing the same to the spaces he and the player have existed in. Majora's Mask's main progression flags are not of conquering bosses and dungeons, although that is an element of the work. The main opposition to Majora and his endless childhood is by confronting the horrors his Arrested Developments have laid out all over Termina with affection and understanding. While killing those major bosses is the main mode of theoretically finishing the text, the player is left unsatisfied with the experience. If, however, the player seeks out mending these wounds, putting lost souls at ease both figuratively and literally, and in doing so collecting different masks as representations of developing the self, Majora's Mask, somewhat in the tradition of Zelda II, is more an odyssey of growth than any text before it. Ocarina of Time fetishizes the childhood, demanding a return to it. In return, Majora's Mask destroys the childhood. When all masks are collected, all selves discovered, the player self achieves enlightenment. The fierce deity mask, an all-powerful tool tailor-made to destroy Majora, given to the player in his sublime and demented toy box at the end of the world, is an assertion of that complete self upon that childhood which the fascist text of Ocarina of Time adulated so much. While not devoid of reactionary tendencies, seeing how the Gerudo operate in the work exclusively as pirates and thieves as an example, Majora's Mask is ultimately a narrative of overcoming such ideological dispositions as displayed through Majora's role in the story as the eternally fetishized past Ocarina of Time had. The ultimate symbolic expression of its defeat being that time will begin to pass normally in Termina, no longer strangled into a time loop liberal end of history with his death. Majora's Mask is the final rejection of the monomyth of The Legend of Zelda, though paradoxically not the last one in spite of its total disregard for tradition. The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker is perhaps the most explicit in its rejection of the narratives of the previous works, even if it is more conflicted in that rejection, which this text's particular expression of Ganondorf is a large part of. Ganondorf, somewhat perplexingly, is positioned as the harbinger of the old, the one upholding the Hyrule of Ocarina of Time who must be defeated to be able to move on into the future. This is all because he opposes the biblical flooding of Hyrule, which was committed solely because of his advocacy for his people's interests. This is ironic, of course, because Ganondorf is the revolutionary who directly opposes the white fascist hegemony of the Hylian Empire, and that is why the racist institutions of The Legend of Zelda portray him as the embodiment of pure evil. Here, however, it is revealed just how fictitious and disingenuous the supposed imagined past fascist ideologies uphold is. Ganondorf adopts the position of trying to rebuild this past, but because it is done by a marginalized entity outside of the Hylian hegemony, the fascists turn their ire against him, destroying their own fetishized history in the hope of burying their victims within it. Ganondorf, ever the renegade advocating for his people, is oddly given the most humanity in this entry in spite of this. The final ideological struggle between him and the player self as the ruins of the land he and his people once nearly usurped flood from divine judgment, one where he is not transformed into beast, unlike Ocarina of Time. In addition, Ganondorf's motivations are explicated and even sympathetic, his desires revealed to be a plea for his people to no longer be slaughtered. The game equates this to a reactionary sentimentality because it questions the specific genocidal hierarchy that they uphold, and so Ganondorf and the Gerudo must be permanently silenced as the one opposition to the rebuilding of the Empire. The literal specter of that dead world the King of Hyrule asserting to Link and Zelda, the latter of whom he revoked the new dark-skinned identity of Tetra from, that they must create a new hegemony as the final bearers of the rotting corpse of Hyrule. Daphne's no Hansen Hyrule, much as his words speak to a wish for a new future, is only interested in said future the moment Ganondorf tries to restore the past for his people and the moment the new future benefits his empire, and thus Link and Zelda are assigned to colonial extraction. And so the Wind Waker's Ganondorf is a radical positioned as reactionary, sunk beneath the sea for his people were extant in the antediluvian world and he sought to protect them, the closest The Legend of Zelda ever gets to allowing the canon's genocidal ideology to be fully explicit. The Legend of Zelda Zelda Twilight Princess poses as a refracted and stained mirror to the Wind Waker. The genocide of the Gerudo, also a major facet of it as a text, though much more subdued as compared to the former work's open discussion of it. It is something that is subtly conveyed through Hyrule's grotesque defilement of the Spirit Temple from Ocarina of Time, the Gerudo place of worship, into incarceration for them, and this is mainly used as a point of comparison against a new species of people introduced in and typically led by the eponymous Twilight Princess, the Twilight. The Twilight are a people who have been similarly marginalized by the Hylian regime, imprisoned in another world to have their labor extracted as hinted by the architecture of the Wind Waker's Tower of the Gods, hewing similar to other buildings of Twilight construction. The Twilight are imprisoned in the Land of Shadows solely because they, much like the Gerudo, and in the same prison where violence was explicated against the Gerudo, struck against the cruelty of Hyrule. However, also similar to the Gerudo of Ocarina of Time, the Twilight of Twilight Princess are largely presented as a people contented with this horrific reality, and the only one who stands opposed to this eventuality is Zant, who serves as the villain of the piece. Zant is perhaps the most fascinating individual in discussion in this text, at once both a further affirmation of the series' fascistic outlook on radical revolutionary thought, his movement to bring his people out of Hyrule's oppression seen as one to be totally stamped out, and also as a unique association of those radical sensibilities with pseudo-intellectualism that The Legend of Zelda has not occupied a bad faith enough space in order to insist upon thus far. Ganon in all his permutations, the Nightmare of Link's Awakening, and even Majora are all entities that, The Legend of Zelda argues, genuinely believe in the causes they fight for, even if it perceives those causes as evil due to the ways they upset the balance of Hyrule as an empire, or in the rare case of Majora, uphold it in its fetishized nostalgia. Zant, however, is revealed within the work's final hours to be functionally another player self-manipulated by Ganondorf, that beneath the mask there is nothing to his ideological perspective as represented by the ludic state of the encounter the player self has against him. Link versus Zant, player versus player, wherein Zant only uses an arsenal of arenas and experiences that the player has already gone through, poorly transposing himself upon memories because there is no ideology of his own for him to commit to discourse with. Twilight Princess then argues that there cannot be a new, genuine, radical strain of thought, an actual revolutionary amongst his people seeking for their betterment. Zant is using the arguments of the old radical Ganondorf, who supplants him at the text end anyway, and the people Zant is trying to lead out of racialized destitution all despise him for it. So Twilight Princess presents a story of two revolutionaries both condemned by their people as they are both straw men of these decolonial ideologies, one sincere and one insincere, the latter ultimately redeemed in the eyes of the narrative as his corrosive, deceitful spirit kills the former in the final beats of the work. These two revolutionaries, regardless of if they genuinely sought their ambitions or not, both stand in opposition to Hyrule's colonial ambitions, even when it is acknowledged that the divine that upheld the empire, fickle and formless, rescinding Ganondorf's power at a moment which is seemingly arbitrary. No sanctuary can be allowed for the other that must be conquered, only oblivion, especially when that conquest is rejected. In response to both Twilight Princess's own fixations on Hyrule's colonial violence as discussed through the Spirit Temple's reconstruction into the Arbiter's grounds, and the Wind Waker's call to action at its end begging both Link and Zelda to create a new world that carries Hyrule's cultural identity through imperialism, The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass directly explores the colonial period which follows the ending of the Wind Waker, Link and the player in tandem exploring and cataloging the domain of the Ocean King, totally exhausting it of its identity in favor of the player self subsuming it all. The text's antagonistic force used closer to the Nightmare of Link's Awakening than Ganon or Majora. Bellum is an amorphous squid-like entity that seeks to stop the colonial force that is Link from taking over the game space, preventing the player self to fully annotate and destroy the text. It is not quite the plea for life which punctuates the Nightmare of Link's Awakening, but it is certainly an outcry silenced. It manufactures its own player self through its use of Linebeck as a phantom, a traditional cultural indigenous automaton to the realm of the Ocean King. Bellum's role is nowhere near as complex as anyone like Zant or Majora, but it is a key idea, that being that even without the Gerudo, Hyrule will still find peoples and cultures to assimilate and destroy. The entire realm of the Ocean King disappeared at the game's end, much like the Windfish's Koholint Island. The realm of the Ocean King was simply a dream of the ocean, one that could no longer exist when forcefully overtaken by the endless violent expansion of Hyrule and the player self, its people reconfigured for its designs and the player. The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks is the culmination of this line of fascistic thought. The lands that Link and Zelda founded have been rechristened New Hyrule, the inhabitants of the land that came before now stratified and subsumed into the new Hylian regime. Even the phantoms of Phantom Hourglass, once a fierce series of golems that stood in the way of conquest from the player self, now are tools of the Empire enshrined in their brief colonial tradition. So brief some of its founders still live, and now under the control of the player self operating as this generation's Link and Zelda, cycles continuing in spite of King Hyrule's smokescreen and hollow words at the Wind Waker's conclusion. Spirit Tracks then positions itself as a new creation myth for the now resurrected corpse of Hyrule, a necessity for it to function. Once more, there's a distrustful and stereotypically coded advisor to the throne who betrays it, in this case Chancellor Cole. A new Ganondorf born from the new class distinctions made in the colonial process, ultimately calling upon the same satanic imagery as Ganon has each and every time, this time aligned more with anti-Semitic stereotypes than anti-Arab ones. A member of the higher classes of society, both ingrained and invaluable to them, yet predisposed to betraying them due to an ethno-religious disparity, is the archetypal expression of anti-Semitism and propaganda. And Chancellor Cole is further vilified by the work through his alignment with the indigenous force of Malladus locked away with the Spirit Tracks, an expression of the industrialization that the Hylians brought with them in colonization. So Chancellor Cole performs his duty to the reactionary text. He provides a villain for New Hyrule to fear, a foundation myth perpetuating the old world's foundation myth, yet under a new banner with minimal discrepancy, a hauntological ghost invoked for the perpetuity of Hylian fascism. The King of Hyrule is dead, long live the King of Hyrule, so Spirit Tracks purports, a zombified corpse which the games seek to sustain forever. But what of Hyrule's original origin point, that monomythic struggle that nearly every text in the extensive catalog of The Legend of Zelda follows? While much of the entries follow Ocarina of Time to some capacity in explicit terms, that itself is not the founding fascistic myth of the Hylian Empire. The work that positions itself as that, then, is The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword is set before the formation of Hyrule and focuses on being this origin point of all the disparate recurring elements of The Legend of Zelda as an artistic movement. Link, and by extension player self, is the heroic weaponization of the state of Hyrule. Zelda is the representation of that fascist state's supposed spiritual purity, and an interloper, be that Ganon or whoever else, that which interferes with this grotesque hierarchy to be made an example of. The one who plays that role in this work is Ghirahim, who, similar to many of Ganon's player selves like Aghanim or Zant, is a herald of demise, the supposed true original sin which tainted the pure Eden that Hylia constructed some time before Skyward Sword. Ghirahim himself plays on a ludic synergy throughout the entire text in performing this role. He's not only an expression of Demise's will in the game's ending movements, it is revealed that he is literally the weapon with which Demise fights. The synergy of swordplay is one of Skyward Sword's core expressions through ludology, the bond between Link and Fi, the spirit of Link's, and by extension the player's sword, mechanically divulged and expanded through the player's total control over where the sword goes. Skyward Sword using precise motion controls to mirror the player's movements with the Wiimote and the meta-reality within the sub-reality of the game space. Thus, Link, Fi, and the player form the work's player self in a uniquely harmonious instance of The Legend of Zelda, and so Demise and Ghirahim are also bonded this way. The ways in which Skyward Sword makes Ghirahim a dark foil to Fi, however, are the same as it ever has been. Ghirahim is a foreign entity, in this case of the surface which the pure virginal Hylia sought to protect her people from, and has interfered with an incarnation of Hylia, the devout and pious Zelda. Compounding this, Ghirahim's manners and affectations are androgyne and homosexual in nature, making passes at Link and fixate on his own feminine wiles. Obviously, not only is there the classical xenophobic twinge which so much of The Legend of Zelda's villains descend from ever since Aghanim was introduced as a foreign entity in A Link to the Past, but there is a homophobic angle now applied, which was a trait that had some echoes in characters like Zant or Chancellor Cole due to their more hysterical tendencies, but Ghirahim fully embodies. This is, The Legend of Zelda argues, the ultimate enemy of the glorious perfect world that Hylia, notably similar to the Columbia of Manifest Destiny Infamy, ordained. The queers which portray the systems of abuse and extraction as Trojan horses for the colonized to dismantle the Empire. Ghirahim is a gay man who is a weapon of a dark-skinned indigenous inhabitant of the planet's surface that Hylia suppressed in order to build her ethno-state of extraction from said surface away from the destruction her war caused and the creatures and individuals her war continues to affect. The only solace Demise and Ghirahim have is, as the game's final moments utter, that they will never disappear, always fighting to revolutionize these systems of abuse into a better future. Horrifyingly, however, this is all a key factor in the Xanatos gambit of fascism. These attempts at usurping and decolonizing, when they are crushed by the hegemony, become mythic ballads through which the ideology and the people are further invigorated to protect the genocidal regime. The Legend of Zelda, of course, is a compilation of those mythic ballads, a series of epic poems to uphold that state of Hyrule like the Aeneid to Rome, and thus the Ghirahims and the Demises will always falter in their righteous quest to overturn it. While all the works of The Legend of Zelda have been further retellings of the same initial narrative about protecting Hyrule for the most part, Majora's Mask ever the outlier, none have gone so far as to recreate the cycle so bald-facedly as the next text does. The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds is, in so many ways, an accelerated returnal to the events of A Link to the Past, to the point that the Link of that work even appears as an elderly man within it. The overall game space is a familiar return to that world, and the overall structure is similar. An interloper from another land has taken hold of Hyrule, and Link is required to conquer the foreign threat and reinstate Hyrule's total dominion. Yuga is Aghanim's hauntological resurrection, but unlike Aghanim, Yuga is compounded by traits of Zelda villains past. Yuga is both openly effeminate in the same ways as Ghirahim before him, and from a land which is exploited and extracted from by Hyrule similar to Ganondorf or Zant. The fascist nation's mirror counterpart, Lorule. Lorule operates in the same thematic and material space as the Twilight Realm, a people and kingdom left in decay by Hyrule and also held captive by them. It is a land where every individual of Hyrule has a counterpart. Hilda, the counterpart of Zelda, seeking revenge on Hyrule with Yuga as her vector. Yuga and Hilda both have a joint machination to topple the Hylian regime, but as the work goes on, Hilda becomes someone the text ends up sympathizing with. She eventually, like Midna of Twilight Princess before her, who begins resenting the Hylians and ends the work forever damning her people for their sake, ends up losing her revolutionary vigor. So Yuga then does all that he can when betrayed by the liberal master he thought would lead him and his people out of solitude, and becomes one with Ganon. The one historic revolutionary in Hyrule, the two synergize as Link and the player more pure in synergy than any player self Ganon has taken on in the past. And yet, this too fails to Link and the player regardless, who have formed an underhanded synergy with the other Link of this text, Ravio. Even when he is crushed by Hyrule's colonial interests, Link is still a weapon of them, assisting in the player's self's quest throughout as a vendor dispensing items to them. Yuga was the one defender of Lorule, all who were supposed to aid the nation ultimately in deference to the will of Hylian hegemony, because ultimately they are all simple mirrors of other selves. The Legend of Zelda so endlessly repetitious in its ontological cycle that it has become only reflections of other events in the most literal sense imaginable. Yuga tries to break this and yet fails, the supposed everlasting period of Hylian fascistic peace once more upheld and Lorule even absolved, a liberal fantasy that the hegemony will save those that it marginalizes and exploits if they simply capitulate hard enough. Lorule is half of Hyrule after all, that needs to pull its own weight, even if it has been the subject of Hyrule's abuse for untold time in an almost comical shadow play congealing archetypes and ideas from across each work of the epic. The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes, much like Majora's Mask, is a bizarre text in comparison to the rest of those aforementioned volumes. Hyrule is not a part of the game's narrative, Link visiting a puppet state of the kingdom called Hytopia, but one that is ultimately distinct from it. There are also 3 links in this text, 3 player selves cooperating to make sense of the work in front of them, and by and large, Triforce Heroes feels as if it's a farcical retelling of the monomyth in an almost Don Quixotean sense. There is a princess and a status quo threatened by a radical interloper, but as opposed to the kidnapping or otherwise deposing of Princess Zelda, Hytopia's Princess Styla has been cursed by Lady Maud to only wear unfashionable clothing for the rest of her life, a death knell in the hyper-bourgeois society of Hytopia where fashion functions as an expression of class positionality, much like so many fascist fixation on vanity in general. It all stands as a complete and utter parody of The Legend of Zelda as a sweeping whole, a mockery of the cycles and systems that the games trade in as artistic objects. However, in spite of all the levity of this text to the point the decayed Hytopian archives themselves are inundated with decayed humor of the postmodern age, there is one important thing to remember. Through all the gender bending and queerness of the ways in which the player self cavorts through these spaces, the Empire is still upheld by the work's conclusion. The player self must still conquer and kill their way to restoring the balance of Hytopia. Lady Maud and her designs, however comical, must be eradicated as a threat to Hytopian hegemony. It all masquerades as a farcical allegory for The Legend of Zelda, an inevitable unseriousness that derives from a series that has allowed itself to be zombified through post-modernity for as long as it has, but ultimately carries the same ideas along with it. The status quo must be upheld and radical forces are trying to destroy the glorious nation, and thus indiscriminate violence must be administered through the player self so the past can be restored to its imagined self and the player self can receive escapist veneration. There is simply no more room for the monomyth of Hyrule in its conventional form, and thusly, like so many things, it must be dealt in insincerities and ironies. Then the monomyth is reborn, substantially, still rotten to its core, a horrific narrative of conquest and colonization for the forces of Hyrule, but this time a depiction of that initial process. While both Spirit Tracks and Skyward Sword provide origin points for the empires of New Hyrule and Hyrule respectively, the active process of colonizing the land is only depicted to some degree in Phantom Hourglass, barring that each and every text is somewhat fascistically conquered by the player self in a metatextual colonization of the work. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is the ultimate expression of both that diegetic colonization, this time with a reactionary vigor of taking taking the land back from the other, which has taken the place of Hyrule's supposed rightful regime, and that metatextual colonization, the sub-reality of the land that was once Hyrule completely at the player's disposal, existing almost entirely as a postmodern wasteland for their own expression. The rogues gallery Link contends with even is largely composed of monsters with which Link engaged in the inaugural The Legend of Zelda, and much like that work, they are completely and totally listless, with them only finding temporary and transient settlements across the broken land that was once known as Hyrule but is now free from that disturbed reign. That who usurped Hyrule, Calamity Ganon, the manifested malice of Ganon, a literal ghost of his will and a haunting upon the narrative representative of the ceaseless suffering inflicted upon him and his people by The Legend of Zelda as a legendarium, is a discordant outcry against Hyrule, completely detached from any structure or society, is another way in which The Legend of Zelda presents any opposition to the fascist regime of the status quo as something untenable and materially unconcerned with the lives of anyone who exists there. The only actual infrastructure found in the land of Breath of the Wild is by those obsessed with restoring Hyrule, portrayed as brave strugglers in the face of Calamity Ganon's stewing. Link aligns himself, and by extension the player in turn does as well, with the remaining people of the old world like Impa or Pota, so the game becomes one of displacing the present population of the land that was once Hyrule, deemed unfit to rule by the workers as anything but the status quo that these works constantly venerate, and consequently ends with Calamity Ganon in all his unending righteous anger for his people partially done in by that same group. The only time the Gerudo allowed sympathy again when they are active asset to Hylian conquest. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is the direct follow-up to Breath of the Wild's Reset to Zero, that colonization of the land that was once Hyrule now completed and monarchical rule restored in the expansive setting. However, with the re-establishment of the nation comes a need for a new creation, another invented for a desperate struggle, and thus Ganondorf is resurrected from his slumber, once more inevitably dehumanized by the end of the text, once more a radical wrench in the machinations of Hyrule's fascist automaton, and once more an example to be made by the player self in the reconquest of the spaces of Breath of the Wild. This is all uniquely juxtaposed against an originating myth for Hyrule that contradicts against the events of Skyward Sword. An ancient tribe known as the Zonai, only beforehand mentioned in disparate apocrypha throughout Breath of the Wild, once controlled the land and divinely ordained it for Hyrule's designs. And even back then, Ganondorf, the same renegade, was there to usurp them, to achieve self-determination for the Gerudo once and for all, as he has done every single time since the inception of them all the way back in Ocarina of Time. Not only is this Ganondorf a threat to Hyrule's new creation myth, however, he is a threat to the old, and thus he must be cut down, so the text argues. In the previous scholarship dissecting the role of the Gerudo in The Legend of Zelda on this channel, it was explicated that The Legend of Zelda is spiritually a reactionary entity, and that the Tears of the Kingdom is the final expression and endpoint of that. And Ganondorf's role in the narrative is a substantial part of that through the way his control of Puppet Zelda is a manifestation of the classical imperialist fetishization of and protection of the bodies of white women as a way of creating a racialized other. This present video affirms that once more and expands on it. The Legend of Zelda, in terms of its conception of good and evil, is a fascist text through and through. Evil throughout The Legend of Zelda, as established in every work besides Majora's Mask, is whatever threatens the status quo and concerns of the Hylian Empire, even in works like Link's Awakening, wherein the text never even mentions Hyrule directly, or Triforce Heroes, where it feels like self-parody. Even when the works purport rebirth, like the Wind Waker's send-off to a new future, Breath of the Wild's total reset of all Hyrule was, it is always exclusively in service of the Empire. The Wind Waker's great flood to wash away and slaughter the Gerudo that opposed their dominion, or Breath of the Wild's reset viewed as opportunity for the player self to reconquer and colonize the lands. All opposition to the state of Hyrule, no matter how righteously indignant, is something that needs to be erased, but not in totality, because after all, demise must return. There must be a perpetual enemy, or else the entire framework the Empire operates on will crumble. The Legend of Zelda is propaganda for a country that doesn't exist, and in turn it reinforces the empires that do exist, the real Hyrules of the world like the United States or England or anywhere else. It allows the postmodern child to live out the fantasy of enacting that colonialist violence as a form of mere entertainment, just as so many works have done ever since colonialism was invented. This has been Arcade Everlasting, who loves The Legend of Zelda in spite of the horrific cycles of abuse and slaughter they depict and encourage for the more impressionistic elements of the works, and thinks that with praise of them must come critique, signing off. Thank you for watching.